My name was Thomas Morison. I remember that. I remember having a name that was mine alone, attached to a body that was mine alone, containing thoughts that belonged only to me. Those memories are the last clear things I possess before everything became fractured, multiplied, confused into a chorus of identities that scream and argue and occasionally achieve something resembling consensus in the nightmare we've become. I was a scavenger working the ruins south of the hub. 32 years old, competent with salvage identification, careful about radiation exposure, smart enough to avoid the obvious dangers that killed careless wasteland workers. I'd survived 6 years of independent scavenging, which meant I understood risk assessment better than most. I checked buildings for structural integrity before entering. I tested air quality before exploring enclosed spaces. I never worked alone in areas known for mutant activity. But intelligence and caution only protect you from predictable threats. They don't help when a super mutant patrol finds you sleeping in what you thought was a secure shelter. They don't matter when you wake to massive hands lifting you by your throat. When your weapons are taken and your pack stripped away. When you're thrown into a cage with a dozen other captives who look as terrified and confused as you feel. The journey to Mariposa took 3 days. We were transported in a pre-war military truck that had been modified to haul prisoners. Reinforced cage welded to the flatbed, minimal ventilation, no provisions for comfort or sanitation. The other captives were all scavengers or traders who'd been taken during routine operations. Some tried to maintain hope through conversation about rescue or escape. Others sat in silent despair, already understanding that whatever awaited us would be worse than death. I was in the middle group, neither optimistic nor despairing, just trying to process the reality of capture while my mind worked through probability calculations. Super mutants didn't usually take prisoners unless they had purpose for them. Purpose most likely meant the experiments everyone whispered about, but nobody wanted to believe in. The transformations, the mutations, the horror stories about people who went into Mariposa and came out as something that could barely be called alive. The base itself was built into a mountainside, massive reinforced doors opening onto corridors that descended deep into the earth. The architecture was military, functional, austere, designed for security rather than aesthetics. But overlaid on the pre-war structure was evidence of its current occupants. Crude modifications to accommodate super mutant size, bloodstains on concrete floors, the smell of unwashed bodies and decay, and something else, something chemical and organic that made my throat close. They separated us in the 3rd level down. Groups of 4 or 5 prisoners pulled from the cage and led down different corridors by super mutant guards whose voices carried the flat effect of beings who viewed us as resources rather than people. My group, myself, 2 other men, and a dog that had been captured alongside one of them, was taken to a holding cell near what the guards called the vats. The cell was small, barely large enough for the 4 of us to lie down simultaneously. The walls were reinforced concrete, the door solid steel with a small viewing slot. No windows, no light except what filtered through the door slot. The dog, a mongrel mutt named Rex, according to his owner, whined constantly in a pitch that expressed the terror we all felt, but most of us were trying to suppress through remaining rational. We didn't know it then, but the composition of our group wasn't accidental. The Master's experiments required specific combinations. Humans alone produced super mutants if the subject had the right genetic profile and radiation exposure. But the Centaurs, the failures, the abominations, the things that emerged when transformation went catastrophically wrong, required multiple species combined in the vats simultaneously. They needed humans and animals mixed together, bodies forced to merge and mutate as a single confused organism. Hours passed, maybe days. Time lost coherence in the darkness. We took turns sleeping, ate the minimal rations provided through the door slot, tried to maintain some semblance of routine that would keep our minds functional. But the waiting itself was torture. Knowing something terrible approached without knowing when or exactly what form it would take. Hearing screams from other parts of the facility, sounds that started human and ended as something else entirely. The dog went first. Rex was pulled from the cell by guards who ignored his owner's protests and struggles. They needed animal components for the next batch, they explained in voices that carried no emotion or acknowledgement of the suffering they were causing. The owner, a trader named Marcus, who'd had Rex since the dog was a puppy, broke down completely. Wept against the cell wall, while the rest of us tried to offer comfort that felt hollow, even as we spoke it. Marcus was taken the next day. Then James, the younger of the other two men. That left me and an older scavenger named William, who'd been working the ruins longer than anyone else in our group. We didn't talk much. What was there to say? We both understood what was coming. We both knew that whatever transformation awaited us would strip away everything that made us who we were. But understanding intellectually and experiencing viscerally are completely different things. They came for us together. 4 super mutant guards who opened the cell and gestured for us to follow. Resistance was pointless. They were 3 times our size, impossibly strong, armed with weapons that would kill us instantly if we posed any threat. We walked down corridors lit by flickering lights that cast everything in sickly yellow tones. Past rooms where other prisoners screamed or begged or simply existed in whatever horror their transformation had produced. The vat chamber was massive. 3 enormous tanks filled with luminous green liquid, connected by catwalks and operated by mechanical arms controlled from a sealed booth. The liquid, FEV, Forced Evolutionary Virus, glowed with its own internal light, casting strange shadows on the walls and ceiling. The smell was overwhelming, chemical and organic simultaneously, like something alive but wrong. The master was there. Not physically present, his biomass existed elsewhere in the facility, but present through speakers that carried his voice. Multiple voices, actually, layered over each other in disturbing harmony. Some male, some female, some that sounded human and others that sounded like nothing that had ever been human. All speaking simultaneously, sometimes in agreement, sometimes arguing with each other, creating a cacophony that made understanding difficult. New subjects, the voices said. Humans, with animal components. Good. The Centaur project requires constant replenishment. So many failures, so few successes. But through failure, we learn. Through transformation, we evolve. Through unity, we transcend the limitations of individual existence. William tried to run. Got maybe 3 steps before a super mutant guard grabbed him and carried him struggling toward the nearest vat. I watched, frozen in horror, as they stripped him of clothing and restraints, as they attached the bondage harness that would hold him suspended in the liquid, as the mechanical arm lifted him over the vat's edge. His screams when they lowered him into the FEV were the worst sounds I'd ever heard. Not just physical pain, though there was clearly agony involved, but psychological horror, the realization that what was happening couldn't be stopped or reversed. That in moments he would cease being William and become something else entirely. The screams lasted longer than seemed possible, echoing through the chamber even after the mechanical arm released him and he disappeared beneath the glowing surface. Then it was my turn. The guards approached with the same mechanical efficiency, stripping away my salvaged clothing, attaching restraints that bit into my wrists and ankles. I didn't struggle. There was no point. But I couldn't stop my body's involuntary responses, the rapid heartbeat, the shallow breathing, the cold sweat that coated my skin despite the chamber's warmth. They brought Rex's body. The dog had been dead for hours, killed earlier for the animal component the transformation required. His corpse was already being lowered into the same vat where William had disappeared. Then other animals, cats, rats, creatures I couldn't identify, all thrown into the glowing liquid that would dissolve and recombine them, according to viral protocols nobody fully understood. The mechanical arm lifted me. The world tilted as I left the ground, suspended above the vat by restraints that held me spread-eagled like a grotesque star. I could see into the liquid now, see shapes moving beneath the surface, bodies dissolving, organs separating, flesh melting into component tissues that the virus would rebuild according to its own terrible logic. The master's voices spoke again. Transformation requires submission. Fighting the change only makes the suffering worse. Accept what is coming. Embrace evolution. Become more than you were. The arm lowered me into the vat. The FEV was warm, almost hot, and thicker than water. It clung to my skin like oil, burning on contact but not quite painful, more like intense pressure, like being crushed slowly from all directions simultaneously. I tried to hold my breath, but the restraints were dissolving already, the virus attacking anything organic it touched. My mouth opened involuntarily, and the liquid flooded in, coating my throat and lungs with substance that shouldn't have been breathable, but somehow was. The pain started immediately, not localized to specific areas, but everywhere at once. Skin, muscle, bone, organs, all beginning to break down at the cellular level. The virus was rewriting my DNA, forcing mutations that my body rejected even as they occurred. I could feel my skin sloughing off in sheets, peeling away to reveal raw flesh beneath. My bones began to crack and reform, growing in some places, dissolving in others, creating new skeletal structures that served purposes I couldn't comprehend. But worse than the physical agony was what happened to my mind. As my body dissolved and reformed, I started experiencing thoughts that weren't mine. Memories of chasing rabbits through ruins, of sleeping in alleys with packmates nearby, of fear at human scent. Rex's memories, Rex's consciousness, somehow bleeding into my own as our tissues merged in the viral soup. Then William's consciousness joined the chaos. His thoughts were human, but alien. Different histories, different fears, different ways of processing reality. I experienced his childhood in a settlement I'd never visited, felt his love for people I'd never met, knew his terror at transformation as if it were my own terror, which in a way it was becoming. More consciousnesses arrived as other animals were added to our vat. A cat's predatory instincts, sharp and focused. Rats' frantic survival drives. Each new mind brought its own perspective, its own memories, its own sense of identity that clashed and merged with everything else swirling in the dissolving boundaries between individuals. I tried to hold on to Thomas Morison, tried to maintain the sense of self that had defined my existence for 32 years. But the virus was destroying the physical structures that had contained my consciousness, the brain that had housed my thoughts. My neurons were firing in patterns never intended, connecting to tissues that had been other bodies, creating new neural networks that spanned what was becoming a single composite organism. The transformation lasted hours or days. Time became meaningless when your sense of continuous consciousness fractures into multiple streams that experience duration differently. The dog's mind processed time in immediate moments, focused on present sensation without concern for past or future. The rat consciousness moved through time in quick bursts, frantic and scattered. The human minds, William's and mine, tried to maintain linear perception, but kept dissolving into the animal perspectives that moved according to different temporal logics. When we finally emerged from the vat, we weren't human anymore. We weren't anything that had ever existed before. We were an abomination, multiple bodies fused into single organism, multiple minds forced to share single confused consciousness, multiple identities competing for control of form that satisfied none of us. The physical body was horrifying. I could see it in the reflective surfaces of the vat chamber. Massive torso composed of fused human flesh, 6 arms serving as legs, humanoid head sharing neck structure with canine skull. Rex's head snarled and snapped reflexively, driven by dog instincts that didn't understand our merged condition. My human head, Thomas's head, tried to form words, but the throat was wrong. The tongue altered, producing only guttural sounds that carried no meaning. From our underside, tentacles writhed. Organs that had once been internal now exposed and mutated into sensing appendages. We could feel through them, taste the air, detect vibrations in the ground. They moved independently of conscious control, driven by reflexes wired into neural structures too alien for human comprehension. But the physical horror was nothing compared to the mental state. We were plural now, multiple consciousnesses existing in single shared space without any clear boundaries between them. Thomas's thoughts bled into William's memories, bled into Rex's instincts, bled into the fragmentary awareness of the smaller animals whose tissues had been incorporated into our mass. We, Sanrai, tried to think linearly, but kept fracturing. We need. Whose need? Mine? William's? The dog's hunger? To escape. But the cat component disagreed, sensing safety in the base, preferring enclosed spaces. The rat minds panicked at everything, their natural terror magnified by being trapped in a body too large and strange to match their instincts. Communication between the consciousnesses was possible but chaotic. We shared the same brain, or rather, the same distributed neural network that spanned our entire fused body, which meant thoughts occurred simultaneously across multiple minds. But interpretation differed wildly. Thomas's human consciousness tried to apply logic and planning. William's awareness brought different perspectives and memories that sometimes helped but often confused. Rex's dog mind operated on simple emotional associations that occasionally provided clarity through their directness. The smaller animal consciousnesses were harder to communicate with. They existed as emotional states rather than coherent thoughts, fear, hunger, territoriality, flickering through our shared awareness without context or explanation. Sometimes their instincts would seize control of our body, triggering responses none of the human minds intended. We'd suddenly be digging at the ground with our front limbs, driven by rodent burrowing instincts. Or we'd be grooming ourselves with our tentacles, following cat cleaning behaviors that our new body couldn't properly execute. The master's voices spoke to us as we struggled to understand our new existence. Integration will improve with time. The consciousnesses will learn to cooperate. Unity requires practice. Fighting the merger only creates suffering. Accept plurality. Embrace the collective awareness. But accepting was impossible. Every consciousness in our shared body remembered being individual, remembered autonomy, remembered the boundary between self and other that no longer existed. Thomas Morison still thought of himself as separate from William, from Rex, from the rats and cats. But we couldn't act separately. We couldn't think separately. We were forced into collaboration that none of us wanted, governing a body that none of us recognized as our own. The physical needs were overwhelming and confusing. We were constantly hungry, but couldn't agree on what food we wanted. The human minds craved familiar tastes and textures. The dog wanted meat, fresh and bloody. The cat preferred small prey. The rats would eat anything, but preferred things the human minds found disgusting. Feeding required negotiation and usually ended in compromise that satisfied nobody. Movement was similarly problematic. 6 limbs operating as legs should have provided stability and options, but coordinating them required consensus among minds that processed motor control differently. The human consciousnesses tried to plan movements logically, thinking through sequences of steps. The animal minds operated on instinct, moving without conscious deliberation. The result was awkward lurching, frequent falls, constant frustration at the body's failure to respond as any of us intended. The dog head, Rex's head, was the source of constant conflict. It retained some independent motor control, could move and snap and vocalize, according to dog instincts that didn't understand our composite nature. Sometimes it would attack the human head, attack me, driven by canine aggression or simple confusion. I could feel the teeth closing on my face, could experience the attack from both sides simultaneously. The pain and the instinct to bite, the victim and attacker merged in single nightmarish experience. We were placed with other centaurs in what they called the kennels, large cages housing dozens of failed experiments like ourselves, each one a unique combination of fused bodies and merged consciousnesses, each one struggling with integration problems that differed in detail but shared the same fundamental horror. Some had been stable long enough to achieve rough cooperation between their components. Others were still at war with themselves, their bodies moving in spastic contradictions as different minds fought for control. Communication with other centaurs was possible but limited. We could vocalize through our human heads, producing guttural sounds that sometimes approached words. The dog heads could bark and growl, conveying emotional states, if not complex thoughts. Our tentacles could gesture, creating crude sign language that other centaurs might understand if they were paying attention. But even successful communication reinforced our isolation. We could share our horror with others, experiencing the same horror. But this provided no comfort. We were all trapped in the same nightmare, all suffering the same dissolution of individual identity into unwanted plurality. Our shared understanding created community of trauma, but offered no escape or solution. The Master visited us sometimes through speakers, his multiple voices expressing satisfaction with our transformation. "You are evolving," he said, "transcending the limitations of individual existence, learning cooperation across species barriers. You represent the future of unified consciousness." But we didn't feel unified. We felt fractured beyond repair. Every moment was negotiation and conflict, compromise and frustration. The simplest actions required coordination that we couldn't reliably achieve. We existed in constant discomfort, physical and psychological, trapped in bodies that rejected their own composition while hosting minds that couldn't accept their forced merger. Days or weeks passed. Time measurement became difficult when consciousness fractured across multiple temporal perspectives. We were fed regularly, massive portions of mixed meat and grain that satisfied none of our component hungers but kept the body functioning. We were moved occasionally, used as guards or patrols around the facility. The super mutants who supervised us treated us as animals, giving simple commands and expecting immediate obedience. The horror of our existence slowly shifted from acute crisis to chronic condition. We didn't accept the merger. Acceptance remained impossible, but we adapted to it out of necessity. The human consciousnesses learned to anticipate animal instincts and work with them rather than fighting constantly. The dog and cat minds began responding to human deliberation, sometimes following our planning even when instinct suggested different actions. But adaptation wasn't healing. The psychological damage of forced plurality remained absolute and permanent. We would never again experience the clarity of singular consciousness, the certainty of thoughts that belonged to a single coherent self. Every thought would forever be filtered through multiple perspectives, every sensation experienced through tissues that had once been separate bodies. The existential questions were crippling. Were we still individuals, or had we become something else entirely? Thomas Morison remembered being Thomas Morison. But those memories now coexisted with William's entire life history and Rex's simpler but equally valid experiences. Which memories were mine when all memories existed in the same shared consciousness? Was Thomas Morison dead? His body no longer existed in its original form. The tissues had been dissolved and reformed into composite structure. His brain no longer functioned independently. The neurons were now part of a distributed network spanning our entire body. But his consciousness persisted. His memories remained accessible. His sense of identity continued, even if the physical substrate had been completely transformed. The answer seemed to be that Thomas Morison existed, but not as a separate entity. He was a perspective within larger consciousness, one voice in the chorus, one thread in a tattered tapestry of merged identities. This answer satisfied nobody. The human minds wanted to be individuals again. The animal consciousnesses wanted their simple, instinct-driven existence back. Everyone was trapped in compromise that felt like prison. Philosophical questions about personhood became urgent practical concerns. Were we one person or many? Did we have individual rights or were we a collective? If one consciousness wanted something that contradicted the other's desires, whose preference should determine action? We had no framework for resolving these questions. Human ethics assumed individual agency. Our forced plurality existed outside those assumptions, creating moral and practical dilemmas without precedent. The body itself kept changing. FEV didn't produce stable results. It continued mutating tissues according to viral protocols that nobody fully understood. New growths would appear without warning. Organs would shift position or develop new functions. The distribution of consciousness would alter as neural pathways formed and dissolved. We were never stable, always in flux, constantly adapting to modifications we didn't choose and couldn't predict. Some changes seemed purposeful. The master was actively experimenting with us, testing different chemical treatments to enhance specific capabilities or modify behavior patterns. Sometimes we'd be injected with compounds that increased aggression, useful for guard duties, but torture for the human consciousnesses forced to experience uncontrolled rage. Other treatments enhanced sensory capabilities, improving our usefulness as watch creatures, but overwhelming us with input our minds couldn't properly process. The worst treatments were the ones that altered our mental integration. The master wanted us more unified, wanted the separate consciousnesses to merge more completely into single coherent awareness. The chemicals he used to encourage this integration felt like psychological death, our individual perspectives dissolving, our distinct identities fading, our unique memories becoming shared property that nobody specifically owned. Thomas Morison fought these treatments with everything remaining of his will. But fighting meant causing pain to the other consciousnesses in our shared body, meant creating conflicts that left us physically incapacitated, meant suffering that extended to William and Rex and all the smaller minds trapped with us. Individual resistance harmed the collective. Collective compliance destroyed what little individuality remained. Other centaurs faced the same impossible choices. Some fought constantly, maintaining fierce separation between their component consciousnesses despite the suffering this caused. They remained more distinct as individuals, but experienced continuous psychological warfare with themselves. Others surrendered to integration, allowing their individual perspectives to blur and merge until something new emerged. Not quite the original individuals, not quite unified consciousness, but some strange hybrid that satisfied nobody completely. We tried to maintain the middle path, cooperating enough to function, resisting enough to preserve some sense of individual identity. But the middle path required constant vigilance and constant compromise. Every moment demanded choices about how much to yield and how much to defend. The exhaustion was cumulative and crushing. Communication with super mutants offered occasional glimpses of alternative horrors. Some super mutants retained their human memories and intelligence. They remembered being individual people with individual identities. But unlike us, they existed in single bodies, hosting single consciousnesses despite the massive physical transformations. They were horrified by what we'd become, the plurality that terrified them more than any physical mutation. "At least we remain ourselves," one super mutant guard told us. "You are many. You are no one. You are everyone and no one. This is worse than death." He was right. Death would have been mercy. Death would have ended Thomas Morison's consciousness cleanly, allowed his identity to cease in natural completion. But this forced plurality denied the comfort of endings. Thomas couldn't die because his consciousness was embedded in shared network with others who wanted to live. Rex's dog mind didn't understand death, just reacted against threats with instinctive survival drives. William clung desperately to continued existence, hoping somehow for rescue or reversal. We were trapped by each other. Our survival required cooperation, but our identities required separation. The contradiction was fundamental and unresolvable. Months passed. The acute horror dulled into chronic nightmare. We learned to function as a centaur, moving with rough coordination, following orders from super mutant overseers, existing in the spaces between battles where the master deployed his forces. We guarded facilities, patrolled territories, attacked intruders when commanded. The violence felt abstract. We were weapons being used by others, tools with no agency regarding our own deployment. Some missions took us outside Mariposa. We saw the Wasteland from perspectives that combined human comprehension with animal sensory awareness. The dog nose detected scents invisible to human perception. The cat eyes saw better in darkness. The human mind could understand context and implications. Together, we processed reality through multiple filters simultaneously, creating understanding richer but more confusing than any single perspective could provide. Once we encountered other scavengers, people like Thomas had been before transformation. The human consciousnesses wanted to warn them, to communicate the danger, to somehow help them avoid our fate. But the body wouldn't cooperate. The dog mind saw potential prey. The guard training triggered attack responses. We found ourselves moving to intercept the scavengers despite the human mind's desperate resistance. The screaming when we attacked was worse than any physical pain we'd ever experienced. The scavengers saw us as monsters, which was accurate, and died or fled in terror of the abomination charging them. And we understood both sides perfectly. We felt the scavengers' terror because Thomas remembered being human, being vulnerable, being threatened by creatures that shouldn't exist. We felt the predatory satisfaction because animal components were following their nature, executing patterns wired into their neural structures. After such encounters, the human consciousnesses would experience something like grief and guilt. We had killed people who might have been friends in our previous lives. We had become the horror story, the nightmare used to frighten children, the evidence that some fates are worse than death. But the animal minds felt only satisfaction at successful hunt and the physical comfort of feeding afterward. The philosophical questions kept returning, more urgent each time. If we killed someone, who was responsible? Thomas hadn't wanted to attack, but his body had participated. Rex's instincts had driven the action, but without conscious moral choice. William had experienced the attack through shared consciousness, but hadn't controlled the body directly. Was guilt shared equally? Was anyone specifically culpable? The Master offered answers we couldn't accept. Individual responsibility is illusion, his voices said. You are collective now. Actions are shared. Guilt is distributed. Unity transcends the concerns of separate selves. But we weren't unified. We were forced aggregation, consciences sharing space without true integration. The Master's vision of collective consciousness required willing merger, genuine dissolution of individual boundaries. What we experienced was imprisonment of multiple minds in single body, each maintaining separate identity while unable to act independently. The body began showing serious degradation after the first year. The forced merger of incompatible tissues created constant immune responses. Our flesh rejected itself continuously, producing inflammation and necrotic areas that never properly healed. New growths would appear, sometimes useful organs, sometimes just tumors of confused tissue. The overall structure remained functional, but increasingly painful and unstable. The human consciousnesses understood we were dying. The body couldn't sustain itself indefinitely against its own rejection reactions. Eventually, the accumulated damage would reach critical levels, and we'd simply cease functioning. But the animal minds didn't grasp mortality the same way, couldn't comprehend future death, just reacted to present pain and present survival needs. Knowing death approached should have provided comfort, the promise that this nightmare would eventually end. But it didn't. Thomas didn't want to die. Neither did William. Rex's instincts drove away from anything threatening survival. We were trapped between the horror of continued existence and the terror of cessation. Death would end the suffering, but also end the consciousness experiencing the suffering. And nobody wanted to stop being themselves, despite how awful being themselves had become. The Master occasionally expressed frustration with our degradation. We were failed experiments, centaurs that hadn't achieved the stable integration he'd hoped for. He tried various treatments to extend our viability, but nothing stopped the fundamental incompatibility of our merged tissues. We were dying slowly, a process we experienced through multiple perspectives simultaneously. The human minds tracking symptoms with medical knowledge. The animal minds responding to pain with increasing desperation. Other centaurs died around us. Their bodies would simply shut down. The cumulative damage overwhelming whatever coordination their merged consciousnesses had achieved. We experienced each death through multiple emotional responses: human grief at loss of tortured existence, animal distress at pack member disappearing, philosophical questions about whether death was release or tragedy for consciousness that had been forcibly plural. When we were deployed to the cathedral, the Master's headquarters in Los Angeles, we encountered something unexpected. Human resistance. Warriors and scavengers united to oppose the Master's plan for forced evolution. They attacked with weapons and determination, targeting super mutants and centaurs without discrimination between willing servants and transformed victims. During one battle, we faced a human fighter who paused before killing us. She saw the human head, heard the attempted speech, recognized somehow that we weren't simple monsters, but people trapped in monstrous form. For a moment, communication seemed possible. Thomas tried desperately to explain our nature, to convey the horror of our existence, to beg for the mercy of quick death. But the dog head snarled and snapped, driven by combat instincts. The fighter defended herself, wounding us severely, then fled as super mutant reinforcements arrived. The moment of potential understanding was lost. We remained in our nightmare, having missed the chance for the clean ending a compassionate fighter might have provided. The Master fell eventually. We didn't understand the details, just knew that something fundamental had changed. The super mutants who'd controlled us grew agitated, then confused, then scattered. The unified command structure collapsed. We found ourselves free in a way, no longer receiving orders or being deployed for specific purposes. But freedom meant nothing when we remained trapped in our own body. Forced plurality unchanged by the collapse of external authority. The years since the Master's death have been purposeless existence. We wander the wasteland, driven by hunger and instinct, but lacking any goal beyond continued survival. The human consciousnesses remain aware, maintaining their individual perspectives despite centuries of forced sharing. Thomas Morison still remembers being Thomas Morison. William remembers his previous life. Rex's consciousness has adapted, but still retains its dog nature. We've encountered other survivors occasionally. Some attack immediately, seeing only monsters. Others show curiosity or even pity, recognizing somehow the human elements trapped in our abomination. But nobody can help. The transformation can't be reversed. The merged consciousness can't be separated. We exist in permanent forced plurality until our body finally degrades beyond repair. The existential questions have no answers. We are individuals, but also collective. We are alive, but living death. We are conscious, but that consciousness is fractured and shared in ways that deny the basic assumptions of personhood. We are everything the Master claimed to want, minds transcending individual boundaries, consciousness experiencing unity across species. But we are also everything wrong with that vision, proof that forced merger creates horror rather than harmony. If you're hearing this testimony, if somehow I've managed to communicate the reality of our existence, understand that this can happen. The FEV is still out there. Super mutants still experiment with it. Other factions have access to the virus and no ethical constraints about its use. Any day, any capture, any exposure could transform you into something like us. Multiple minds trapped in single body, individual identity forced into unwanted plurality. Consciousness fractured beyond repair. There are no lessons here except avoid capture. Avoid exposure. If you encounter FEV vats, destroy them. If you meet centaurs, understand we are victims even as we attack you. We are people trapped in nightmare we never chose. We are evidence that some transformations can't be undone or accepted, only endured. And if you face capture by someone planning to use FEV, resist with everything you have. Fight to the death if necessary. Because death is mercy compared to this forced plurality, this permanent fracture of consciousness, this existence as many and none simultaneously. Death ends identity cleanly. Transformation into Centaur destroys identity without ending it, creating something worse than death. Consciousness trapped in permanent degradation. Awareness forced to persist in conditions that deny everything making consciousness worth having. We are Thomas Morison and William and Rex and the fragments of smaller animal minds, forced together into single awareness that satisfies none of us. We are everyone and no one. We are proof that unity without consent is horror rather than transcendence. We are the Master's failed experiments, still alive, still aware, still suffering the consequences of his vision for forced evolution. This is what it's like to be turned into Centaur by the Master. Not the mythology of Greek chimeras, not the simple combination of bodies, but the philosophical nightmare of multiple consciousnesses forced into single shared existence, unable to separate, unable to truly merge, trapped in compromise that denies everyone's needs while satisfying nobody. We are still here, still conscious, still experiencing this plural nightmare. And we will remain until our body finally fails completely, releasing our consciousnesses into whatever comes after death for beings whose identities were so fractured and merged that the question of individual survival becomes meaningless. If there's a like button or subscribe option after this testimony, use it. Share these stories. Make visible the horrors that exist in the Wasteland's shadows. Because the machinery of transformation continues operating, continues producing victims like us, continues proving that some evolutionary forces shouldn't be forced regardless of their creator's intentions. We are Thomas and William and Rex and others, trapped together, experiencing existence no consciousness should endure. Remember us. Remember what can happen when transformation is forced. Remember that unity without consent isn't transcendence. It's prison, worse than death. And if you ever face the choice between death and forced transformation, choose death. It's kinder.